If you go down to the 55-pound rail, you are code 83 in the O scale. And you have to go down to the 75-pound rail to go to code 100 in O scale and code 55 in HO. Notice when you go down to the 110-pound rail, you're at the 125 for the O, code 70 for HO, and code 40 for N. Now, I know the issues of HO because I just bought some track for an HO layout I'm building, and I noticed I couldn't get the switches any smaller than code 83. So you have an issue there with the prototype. Now, also an interest in the size of the rails, code 100 rail is 75-pound in ASCII standards, but in the prototype, the ASCII head of the rail is 0.050. And notice actually above that, just above the 35-pound thing, it says 40-pound, and the row A is 0.041. So actually code 100 is 100, 100, and 40 thousandth across. So it doesn't match the rail. The sizes aren't exactly right. But I said, I know that you have to have something that's reliable, operatable. So you have to pick and choose, but you want to take the rail size down as really as small as you can get it to match the prototype. This is a website that has a lot of information on steam locomotives. You can find on there, do a little searching on there. You can find any wheelbase you want. Any locomotive ever built in the United States is on this website. And it gives all the technical information of the steam locomotives, including the wheel rate, the rail weight, what you need, what is the minimum rail weight. And this is important because you look at the Allegheny they had over to B&O Museum, it crushed the rail. The rail was not heavy enough to carry the locomotive and actually crushed the rail over there. So you do have, rail size issues that, mimic the prototype that is nice to try and replicate in the modeling. In my days when I was doing the South Park in ON3, I had code 70 rail from my old HO layout, which is totally inappropriate, but it is perfect for 35-pound rail, which is exactly what they used. When I came to the Midland, which I do now, and as I said, this applies to any railroad, no matter what railroad you're doing. I'm using the ones that I know, the ones I model. Most of the railroad ran 60-pound rail. The section between Basalt and Grand Junction was 45-pound rail. And usually they had 8-wheelers from the Santa Fe they used down in that area because the grade was lighter, and so was the rail. In my O-scale layout, I have used code 100. Now, admittedly, the foot of the rail is 100 across and 100 high, but the head is only 40, which visually brings the rail down in size, which is the closest I can get to code, to a 60-pound rail. It makes a nice, thing. And actually, Paul Dawkins made a comment about how prototypical it looked because of the spacing and the rail size. So it is important to try and achieve, the best you can in this. As the railroad evolved, these two 20th century engines they bought, one just after the turn of the century and one in 1906, the 300s, used heavier rail. And the railroad began to include heavier 70, 80, 90-pound rail. The rail between Basalt and Grand Junction was not really upgraded, and these engines were not allowed to run on that part of the railroad, which brings us another issue about rail size and what the chief engineer would have to say and what they could do. And of course, the resources they'd have available to replace the rail and move on to something better. When the Rio Grande brought these narrow gauge, they weren't K27s when they were bought. They were, I think they were N125s in 1903. There were a whole slew of parts of the railroad these engines were not allowed to run on because of the axle loading. A few years before this, in 1880, I think it was, they bought one C16, which is actually an N60 back then. It was too heavy, and they had to retrograde and ordered N56s. But a couple of years later, they had upgraded the railroad and ordered 100 of these C16s, the N60s. So this is an interesting thing about rail size And while you may not be able to replicate this in the modeling operation, I would suggest maybe including this as, branch line only allow this, certain areas of the railroad, maybe there's a bridge issue, a loading, whatever else. You could include this in the operational issue of what the rail size and what the engines will do. The Rio Grande wanted to acquire the Salt Lake Moffett Tunnel line. The rail in that part of the railroad was suitable for their Moffat's 2660s, which were quite light, and it's only 82-pound rail. And the heaviest thing the Rio Grande could put on there was their first 2882s, which had a fairly light axle loading. Double head, and this would have to be this way in the 1930s until they upgraded the roadbed and upgraded the track size, rail size, to accommodate larger locomotives. Curvature of the track. It impacts the speed, the rail size. I mean, if the sharper the curve, the heavier the equipment, the bigger the rail has to be to carry the weight of the locomotives. Spikes, supports, roadbed, elevation, super elevation, what type of engines, the wheelbase, how long they are, what all the issues involved with this, with curvature. In the Midland, most of the railroad was 16 degree, which is a 360-foot radius, and that's teeny. That is really tight. And the O scale, that is about 7.5 feet across, a little more than 4 feet for HO. I was able to achieve about 55% of this on my layout. And that is about the minimum I could ever do, because the locomotives begin to have a problem. And you also have the issue of the coaches hanging over the rail, so to speak. I remember seeing an advertisement a year or two back in Model Railroad that showed the Amtrak train, and it must have been on like a Lionel curve, and you could see the rail hanging out on the outside and almost see the inside rail under the car. It was very unprototypical. And so what I'm asking is to, suggest you open the rails up as much as possible. You also have an issue of curvature of the track of what wheelbase your locomotive is going to be. A lot of the big ones like the Virginians 210-10-2s, the first two drivers are flanged, the next two drivers are blind, the last driver is flanged. Then you go to the second engine and it's flanged, two blind, two flanged. This is allow the engine to slide over the rails and give you a little better curvature, but you're still talking about what size engine you're going to have and what curvature you can have. This is a picture of a rail brace I got my hunting trip out west on the South Park. Even on the South Park and narrow gauge, this thing is put in. The railroad was abandoned in the late 30s. And these type of apparatuses are used in switches and on sharp curves and are available in Walthers, and I'm sure they're available in Proto 48 because a lot of the tie plates and all that kind of stuff are available individually. And these are nice things to include against the rails and add a little extra interest to your railroad and actually make it look a little more prototypical. I would ask you to think of how wide you can make the curves, not how sharp you can make these things. And the NMRA website gives you a series of locomotives. I didn't include them all, but what these are the wheelbase of the engines. And of course, the longer the wheelbase, the wider the curve has to be. Now, you might be able to get by with a sharper curve, but again, you begin to lose your prototype feel and things look more like a toy. Then I assume you would like to make a model railroad and look more prototypical. Bridges. Well, this type of bridge is a nice illustration, but of course it would never hold up in real life. And this is one of the things I think a lot of attention can be used to improve the quality of railroad and mimic the prototype. I remember seeing a beautiful trestle built for an AP program at one of the MMR conventions. And there was all kinds of things left off the bridge, and it didn't qualify because they didn't follow the standards of building bridges. This is a very good book. This is available in the Library of Congress online. I bought it a few years ago before it went online, an electronic copy. This is a book that gives you all kinds of information on structures, railbeds, curvatures, all kinds of other things. If you are a closet case mathematician and like filling with trigonometry, this is your baby. This would be a lot of fun. There are about 2/3 of the book all deals with curvatures and trigonometry and whatever else, but there are a number of illustrations in this thing. It gives you a wide variety of ways that railroads breach tunnels, how they open the tunnels up, what kind of ties countries were using. Germany was using 35% of its ties were steel in 1900. And so you have a lot of information here to do. A lot of it's not going to be important to you. A lot of it's not going to fit to the railroad, but it is interesting, and it is available on Library of Congress. And that's Walter Loring Webb, Railroad Construction, Theory and Practice. This is the usual thing, one of the things you see in there about how to do all the grading. This is, of course, for a modern railroad. One of the things you have advantage in the river railroad, your gravel is very heavy, whereas when my live steam, I had to encase the gravel in dirt so it wouldn't wash away. But you do have this issue in a real railroad. Of course, you never allow water anywhere near the roadbed. And so you have to have grading and tile drains, whatever else, to take any water, rainwater, river water away to get it away from the roadbed, because it will destroy the roadbed. This is of course, a standard trestle bend and gives you all the dimensions of what's there. That's fairly standard. Most everybody understands this. It's 3x12 swing braces and 12x12 posts and caps and the feet and how big they are. But what most people don't understand is when you get to the third and fourth tier, what happens. And notice the increase in sway braces and the angle beams going down to the ground. It multiplies. Now, this is not the only way to do it. Every railroad's had different ways to do it depending on what their needs were. But this is one way, and you have proof if you're doing an AP bridge. This would be your proof of how actually to build the sway braces and all the structure. Now, the application of standards to this particular bridge, this is called a mountain trestle on the Colorado Midland. This was put in the 1880s, 90s, was taken out at the turn of the century. It's about a quarter mile long, and if I were to model this in O scale, it'd be 22 feet long, about 14 in HO. And the speed limit on this was only 10 miles an hour because of the thrust of the locomotive and the train on the bridge. And as a closer look, you'll notice that the top tier, if you see my arrow, you see the top tier has the vertical things and it's slanted 12x12s and cross braces. And right in here, under the caboose, it looks like there's multiple sway braces even there. But if you look down at the lower tier, the second tier, the 12x12s are doubled. And it looks like they're tripled on the third tier. But you look at the far and the left side of the picture, and they're still singled. So as you go over the single run, you'll have the one beam going down. But as you get into the curve where you have more thrust issues, you double and triple what's there to carry the extra load. So the bridge doesn't, swing out and disintegrate on you. Well, if you have a modern bridge, this was taken on the Fagua system in Guatemala back in '71. And these are, the railroad had a large number of Baldwin Mikados. They're quite similar to these broad-top engines. It's a state-run railroad, and of course it had the money to build bridges, and this nice modern bridge. Now, of course, this would not take a heavy locomotive, but it would certainly take what they run. And what do you do, when the railroad gets too big? You get larger engines, the bridge comes out of date, you have problems. This is a Colorado Midland bridge built in 1880s, and it was designed to carry one locomotive and a train. You can still see the piers there. I can stand on the left side over here and I look down in the gorge. This is just a small area where the railroad had to go across a bridge. And this is all the trains were when it initially ran, one locomotive and cars. But as the railroad evolved, they double-headed, and therefore you have more weight. And as the railroad got further into the 19th century, the larger engines were being used, and they were being triple-headed, although the three engines were not together, they were spaced through the train. Here's the same bridge taken in 1819, or 1918 rather, and notice that they had cut the spans in half with wood bends. Under the big steel trestle where the first locomotive is, the center is a bend, and you have bars going across. And under the rear of the tender is the second one. And under the third driver of the second engine is another bend. And under the joint between the engine and the last car is another bend. So what they did was they halved the distance and therefore increased the capacity of the bridge very simply, very cheaply, to accommodate almost a third of 300,000 pounds of locomotives. That is a jackass. Okay, on the Rio Grande, as an example of bridges, this is taken in the Black Canyon of the Gunnison. And this used to be the Rio Grande's main line, transcontinental line, which has been, of course, replaced by the standard gauge later on. This part of the line never was upgraded. The railroad was built to carry consolidations, and this bridge and the track would not accommodate anything heavier than a C-21 engine. The C-25, they had the one, no, it would not run, and K-27s were not allowed on here at all. Between Gunnison and Cimarron, no Ks were allowed on this railroad. The Ks were allowed from Cimarron over to Montrose because there are no bridges and the track was heavy enough to take it. But this kind of bridge would not take a heavy locomotive. Fuel, water capacities. In doing the chief engineer designing a railroad, in the Midland, the water tanks were about every 15 miles apart and coal was 30. Now, when the first engines arrived on the railroad, 7 tons, 3,850 gallons of water, and that's what would carry one locomotive and a train that engine could pull 15 miles or better to the next tank, or maybe a little further. As the engines increased in size, notice the capacity of the tenders go up. And that's to accommodate, so they're using more coal, they're using more water, and therefore the capacity has to go up to meet that 15-mile tank issue. Now, different railroads have different mileage, whatever else, depending on the grades, but notice that the size of the locomotives require bigger tenders to accommodate this. This is a coal dock in Basalt, Colorado, and this is a shot taken in front of the coal dock after one of their Baldwin 10-wheelers blew up. No one was killed, but the reason for the picture is the coal dock. Notice right above the target on the switch stand is the coal bins. This is hand shoveled from the gondola on the far top right side. It's shoveled into the dock and you pull the gate down and it dumps into the tender. It is quite shallow. It's not a very big coal dock, and that's to accommodate these 10-wheelers, and their sister consolidations were exactly the same size. Why they had 10-wheelers and consolidations, if it basically exactly the weight and whatever else, I don't understand that particularly, but these were dual service engines. The consolidations were freight, of course, but the capacities were the same, and that size of a coal dock would supply this engine with sufficient coal. We get to 1900 and notice that the dock has been elongated. It's about, maybe 50% bigger. Again, that was built for a larger engine. Now, one of the things that's constantly asked about this cattle car up here, why the stock car is on this thing, the stock car, in my opinion, is there in sand service. The sand house is just the other side of that car. I think sand is delivered in bags, and that's why the stock car is there. End of that story. Anyway, the bigger coal dock is to accommodate this class of engine from Baldwin that came in 1897, and it requires a larger coal load. Therefore, the bins have to be larger to provide sufficient fuel for these locomotives. We come to the end of the railroad's history, and during the dismantling process, notice that the coal dock had been completely replaced. Now it's being torn down, of course, but it's completely replaced by a much more modern type of dock that would handle a much larger amount of coal for the locomotives that they had bought, which were these. And of course, there were dreams at one time of having articulated engines, which would be even larger. And one of the interesting things about this, some of the axle loading on articulated engines is less than it is for Mikado. I went and looked on that website, and there was a 282 rather, that had a heavier axle loading than a 2882. You have the axle, the weight spread over more axles, therefore slower. But the Midland never wanted articulated engines. These were the heaviest they ever had, although they were planning to buy something equivalent to a Rio Grande would be like their heaviest engine was a C-48, and the Midland was planning to buy like a C-52, but even that is out of date. Rio Grande had much larger engines, but you still have the same issues of water. This is what they run out of. The L-131 on the front of this engine, there's a M68 behind it, is Northern, and this is Express refrigerator train. It took 3 of these L-131s to push 50 cars up the pass. 2 would take off, be put on at Minturn, and 2 would be taken off at the top of the pass at Tennessee Pass. The water tank up there they had 2 tanks to accommodate all this water. And if the engines had to pull over and stop for a downhill train, which had priority, they could not make the run and had to retank on the way up. So this is the issue of the size of the tanks. They're designed for a particular thing. The railroad wanted this for this engine, and this is where these engines always served. When the railroad bought its F-81s, its 210-2s, they were always on the Soldier Summit line. Their USRA 2882s they had built right after the war also were built for the Soldier Summit line. So Pacific engines are only in specific places. Now this is a timetable from 1897, and with the arrow and the lines are not the point I'm going to discuss here. Notice that you have a capacity of sidings. And as the railroad evolves, and as any railroad evolves, the trains get bigger. When Midland started, it had 1 engine, pull about 4 or 5 cars, and the passing sidings would accommodate that. By the time you get near the end of the century, they're running double headers, 10 cars, and the sidings have to be extended for passing purposes. After you get into the 20th century, they go to 3 engines, a road engine, mid-engine, and a helper at the back. And the trains will go up to 15 cars or so, and they have to extend the sidings again. So you do have information here on the timetables, how big these sidings are and how long they were and how many cars they could accommodate. And here is a listing of the power of the locomotives. And these can be found in books, whatever, on your particular railroad, more than likely. This is the tractive effort on a 3% grade. And notice that the 10-wheelers, 4 cars. The 10-wheelers are the 52-inch drivers, 5 cars, but you'd have to reduce the speed because you can't heat the boiler supply with enough steam if you open it up too big. The other engines, of course, the biggest one you have down there, I have on my railroad, pull 7 cars. And you put these together and you have to have water tanks to accommodate all this extra water and what the engines will pull. Okay, it's important if you want to follow the prototype or mimic the prototype is to understand what these engines will do, where they run, why they're there, and what the railroad's limitations are. This is a C-21 on Cirro Summit. This is between Cimarron and Montrose. And this engine, it only pulled 3 cars. It has 3 trips to make to pull the full train up the top of the pass. And this is what they usually ran in here. There are Ks-27s that operate on this with the heaviest they could put there, but that was pretty much it. The Duluth and the Sabi Iron range, the Rio Grande rented these, and this is only operated along the front range between Denver and, say, Pueblo or Walsenburg. And that's where these engines would operate. But as I said, each engine did its job and worked a very specific place. And so my final thing was, let the prototype speak. Try and follow as best you can. I know you can't always do it, but
Andrew,
try and do it. Yes, we're out of time.
we got 2 minutes.
We're out of time.
Okay, I set up a second meeting.
Okay.
It's going to start at 3:40.
Okay,
I've sent it out via email, but I'm going to provide you the meeting ID and the password for the 340 extension. Okay.
You sent that to my Yahoo or the.
I've sent it to everybody on MailChimp.
Okay, fine. I'll go to it now.
Okay, so I'm going to give you the information, folks, so you got it. If you're ready to write this down, please. The meeting ID is going to be 725-8330-0501. That's 725-8330-0501. 833-0501.
Got it.
The password is the number 6. Small P as in Paul, small V as in Victory, small S as in Samuel, the number 7, A as in Apple. That's 6,
Is that
Paul,
Apple, the small A?
small A.
Okay.
6, small Paul, small Victor, small Samuel, 7, small Apple.
Okay, got it.
So this thing's gonna be kicking us off. Like I say, at 3:40, we'll be able to get back on with that
Okay.
that clinic.
Okay.
Okay.
This is Alan Sinclair. If you want to try something, I have the pro version for some other meetings that I have to hold. And if I've heard correctly,